The leash snapped taut before Jackson Reed's mind caught up to what his hand already knew. Diesel had been walking at a perfect heel for 6 blocks. Then, he wasn't. The German Shepherd locked up mid-stride outside the Bellwether Public Library, ears driving forward, every muscle along his spine gone rigid as rebar. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared down the block toward the bus shelter on the corner of 5th and Larch, and then the leash tore through Jackson's fingers and Diesel was running. 82 pounds of trained muscle crossed 4 lanes of morning traffic without slowing for a single car. Jackson ran after him, calling a command Diesel had obeyed instantly for 2 straight years and ignored completely now. The woman at the bus shelter didn't move. She had a shopping cart wedged against the bench, 2 garbage bags of folded clothing, and a coat held together with safety pins instead of buttons. People had been stepping around her cart for 20 minutes without making eye contact. Diesel didn't slow down when he reached her. He pressed his whole body against her legs, tail working so hard his back end nearly left the ground, and shoved his head up under her hand the way he hadn't done for anyone since the day Jackson brought him home. The woman looked down. Her hand was already moving toward his ear, finding the notch in it without searching for it. "Diesel," she said. "There you are." She said his name like she'd been the one to give it to him. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching this from in the comments below. If a story about a dog who remembers has ever meant something to you, stay with us until the end. Because this one is about to ask a question Jackson Reed didn't know he needed answered. What does a homeless woman on a bus bench have to do with the dog who just sprinted into traffic to reach her? Jackson Reed was 42 years old, built with the kind of economical strength that comes from 2 decades of carrying more weight than the job required, and never once mentioning it. He stood just over 6 feet, with a frame that didn't broadcast itself in a t-shirt but became unmistakable the moment he moved. Shoulders set, weight centered. The stillness of a man who had spent half his adult life learning to occupy a room without announcing it. His hair was cut close and going gray at the sides faster than he liked to admit. A thin white scar ran along his left jaw, a souvenir from a line that had nearly taken his face off during a training exercise off the coast of Coronado in his 23rd year of service. His eyes were a flat, pale gray that people described, without quite knowing why, as unsettling, not cold, but assessing. The eyes of a man who had spent years reading rooms for exits and threats before he'd ever learned to read them for anything else. He was not unfriendly. He simply no longer spoke first. Life, and 11 deployments, had sanded that instinct out of him somewhere between Ramadi and a base he still wasn't permitted to name. He moved through the world with the contained patience of a man who understood, in his bones, the difference between a situation that required force and one that required almost none at all. That patience was the thing that made what happened 3 weeks later land like a thunderclap to everyone who witnessed it. Because nobody in Bellwether had ever once seen Jackson Reed raise his voice. He'd spent 19 years as a Navy SEAL, the last 6 as a senior chief assigned to a special warfare detachment that didn't appear in any public record. He'd served in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in places his own discharge paperwork simply listed as classified. He'd lost 2 men from his platoon in a single afternoon outside Kandahar in 2014, and he still woke some nights hearing the radio call that came in after, though he never told anyone that. He'd retired 2 years ago, not from injury, though his left knee carried 3 screws that disagreed loudly with cold weather, but because the Navy's K-9 transition program had offered him something he hadn't expected to want, a second career pairing retired military working dogs with veterans who needed exactly what he needed. A reason to get up, something that depended on him showing up. Diesel had been his first placement. Jackson had meant to give the dog a home. He hadn't expected the dog to give him one back. Diesel was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, 82 pounds of black and tan muscle, his coat darkening to near black along the spine and ears, with a notch missing from his left ear where shrapnel had clipped him during a deployment to Helmand Province 4 years earlier. His first handler had not survived that deployment. Diesel had spent 11 months in a kennel afterward, refusing nearly every handler the program tried to pair him with, until the day Jackson walked into the facility and the dog simply stood up and walked to the gate without being called. He moved with the clean, economical confidence of an animal who had learned the hard way the difference between noise and threat. He did not react to sound, he reacted to meaning. In 2 years, Jackson had watched him ignore gunshots on a firing range and come instantly alert at the sound of someone crying 2 rooms away. Jackson had never once seen him run toward a stranger. Until today, Bellwether sat in the foothills of western Montana, a town of 11,000 people built around a river that froze solid by December, and a main street that had spent the last 3 years being renovated into something it had never quite been before. New brick facades, gas lamp streetlights, a coffee roastery where the hardware store used to be. The morning air still carried the bite of an early frost, sharp enough to sting the lungs. The library bells had just finished striking 9. Somewhere down the block a delivery truck idled, exhaust curling white into the cold. The bus shelter where Diesel had stopped sat at the exact seam between the renovated half of downtown and the half that hadn't been touched yet. The renovation had a name, the Bellwether Riverside Initiative, and it had a face. Preston Holloway, 46, executive director of the Business Improvement District his own family had quietly funded into existence 3 years earlier. Holloway's name sat on the donor plaque outside the new amphitheater. His construction company held the contracts for half the buildings going up along Larch Street. He sat 2 seats down from the mayor at every council meeting and had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Because what he wanted usually got written into a zoning variance before anyone thought to ask who'd requested it. For the past 8 months, Holloway had run what the bid's internal memos called corridor beautification, and what the people living under the 5th Street overpass called something else entirely. Tents were cited for code violations at 6 in the morning, before their owners woke. Belongings left unattended for cleaning did not come back. The police, who answered to a chief whose re-election campaign Holloway had personally financed, treated every complaint as a courtesy call rather than a crime. Nobody in 3 years had filed a grievance that survived contact with Holloway's attorney. A reporter at the Bellwether Sentinel had tried once and been quietly informed over coffee that advertising contracts were a fragile thing. This town doesn't need a homeless problem to fix, Holloway had told the council in October. It needs a homeless problem to relocate. Nobody on the council had disagreed with him out loud. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and before anything had been taken from her, she had spent 19 years as a civilian dog trainer attached to the 341st Training Squadron at a base in Texas, teaching young military working dogs the difference between a sound that meant nothing and a sound that meant everything. She still woke most mornings at 5 out of habit and folded her blankets into a square before she did anything else, because a trainer had taught her decades ago that how you start a morning is how you finish a mission. She did not panhandle. She did not invite pity into a conversation. She kept the small patch of sidewalk around her bench swept clean with a torn piece of cardboard, because the woman she had been would not have tolerated the woman she'd become living in filth. She was 64 years old, and she had buried a son, and she had not said his name out loud in 4 years. Jackson reached the bus shelter half a minute behind his dog, breath ragged, the cold burning in his throat. Diesel hadn't moved. He stood pressed against the woman's knee, eyes half closed, the particular stillness of an animal who has stopped searching for something because he has finally found it. "I'm sorry," Jackson said. He's never done that. He's never run from me in 2 years. The woman didn't look up right away. Her hand kept moving slowly along the ridge of Diesel's spine, the kind of touch that knew exactly where a working dog carried its tension. "He's not running from you," she said. "He's running to something he recognized. You know him." "I trained him," she said it simply, without performance, the way a person states a fact they have stopped expecting anyone to believe. 8 years ago. Lackland, he came through my obedience block before he ever went operational. I'm the one who named him. She looked up at Jackson for the first time, and her eyes were a faded hazel, sharp despite everything around her that suggested she should have stopped being sharp a long time ago. "Diesel," she said again, like she was testing whether the word still fit. "Because he never quit when the other pups gave out. He just kept going. Like an engine." Jackson crouched down slowly, the way he'd crouch in front of a checkpoint he didn't fully trust, and let that information settle. 8 years. Lackland, a trainer who'd vanished off the record somewhere between the dog's deployment file and the program's adoption paperwork, the way good people sometimes do when a system stops accounting for them. He didn't get to ask his next question. A black SUV pulled to the curb, and a man in a gray jacket stenciled bellwether bid stepped out with a clipboard and the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this enough times to find it boring. "Ma'am, you're going to need to relocate the cart. This bench is part of the active corridor zone." Eleanor didn't argue. She started gathering her bags with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had relocated more times than she could count. Motion that had stopped feeling humiliating only because she'd buried the part of herself that used to feel humiliation about it. Jackson stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stepped, without hurry, into the small space between the bid employee and the woman, and Diesel moved with him, sitting at her side like he'd been posted there. "Give her a minute," Jackson said. The man glanced at the dog, then at Jackson's stance, and something in his face recalculated. "I just do what I'm told," he said, and retreated to the SUV to make a call. The call took 4 minutes. When the man in the gray jacket got back out, his posture had changed. Less bored, more careful. The posture of someone who'd just been told who he was dealing with and didn't fully understand why it mattered. "Mr. Holloway would like to speak with you," he said to Jackson. "He's at the office on Larch." Jackson didn't go that day. He took Eleanor to the diner on 4th instead, bought her a hot breakfast she ate slowly and without apology, and asked questions in the careful, sequenced way he'd once used to debrief frightened civilians in a language he'd had to learn fast. What came out in pieces was a story he'd heard variations of before, in different uniforms, on different continents. A son, Specialist David Voss, killed by an Eid outside Kandahar in 2018. A mother who stopped sleeping. A brother-in-law who'd been granted financial power of attorney during the worst 6 months of her life and had used it to sell her house out from under her before she'd fully understood what a conservatorship was. By the time Eleanor surfaced from her grief, there was no house, no savings, and a brother-in-law who no longer returned calls. She'd been on the street for 14 months. Jackson made 2 calls of his own that afternoon. The first was to a friend still serving as a master-at-arms at Naval Base San Diego, who confirmed Eleanor's employment record at Lackland inside an hour. 19 years. An excellent service record. An early separation following a documented family bereavement. The second call was to a woman named Tess Brennan, a Bellwether Sentinel reporter Jackson had met at a Veterans Day ceremony the year before, who picked up on the second ring and said, "Before he'd finished explaining, I've been trying to get someone with a badge to talk to me about Holloway's sweeps for 8 months. Nobody will go on record." "I'll go on record," Jackson said. That evening, Diesel refused to settle. He paced the length of Jackson's small house twice, then sat by the front door and stared at it for 11 minutes, ears tracking every sound from the street, until Jackson finally understood and drove back downtown to check on Eleanor himself. He found her exactly where he'd left her, unharmed, but rattled. A different bid vehicle had circled the block 3 times in the last hour. Holloway, Jackson understood now, did not let things go. He understood something else, too. Watching Diesel press his head into Eleanor's lap and refuse to move, whatever happened next, the dog had already decided which side he was on. The arrest happened on a Tuesday, while Jackson was 40 miles away delivering a guest lecture to a veteran support group in Missoula, his phone on silent in his coat pocket the way he'd been trained never to leave it. By the time he saw the missed calls, Eleanor had already spent 6 hours in a holding cell at the Bellwether Police Department on a trespassing citation that listed her offense as unauthorized occupancy of a public bench. Her cart and both garbage bags of clothing, including the one photograph she had left of her son in his dress uniform, had been confiscated as unclaimed property and were already gone by the time anyone thought to look for them. The officer who'd made the arrest hadn't wanted to. He told Jackson as much, quietly, in the precinct hallway, before adding that the call had come down directly from the chief's office less than an hour after a Sentinel reporter started making inquiry calls about the bid's sweep program. Holloway was not subtle when he was frightened. He simply moved faster. Jackson found Diesel in the precinct lobby, where a desk sergeant had finally given up trying to make him leave. The dog was lying flat against the door that led back toward the holding cells, chin on his paws, refusing every command to move that wasn't Eleanor's voice. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't taken water. He had simply waited. The way working dogs wait at a door they have decided they will not abandon. Jackson didn't raise his voice at the desk sergeant. He didn't raise it at the watch commander, either, when the man finally appeared. He simply stated, in the flat, factual register he'd once used to brief commanding officers under fire, exactly what he knew, exactly what evidence existed, and exactly how many people outside that building were now paying attention. Something in his stillness made the watch commander reach for his phone before Jackson finished the sentence. Eleanor was released 90 minutes later into a lobby that had gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen, and everyone in them can feel it. Diesel rose the moment the door opened. He didn't run to her this time. He walked, slow and deliberate, and placed himself directly between Eleanor and the watch commander's desk, sitting square, refusing to be called away, his eyes fixed on the man with an attention that needed no translation. Nobody in the lobby moved for a long moment. The watch commander looked at the dog. He looked at the notch in its ear and the steadiness in its stance, and something in his face changed, the look of a man recalculating exactly how much trouble had just walked into his building. The town council meeting that Thursday was, under ordinary circumstances, sparsely attended. This one was not. Tess Brennan's story had run that morning under the headline, "Who is Bellwether clearing the streets for?" naming Holloway's construction contracts, the bid's unrecorded sweep budget, and a sworn statement from Eleanor Voss, civilian veteran, 19 years of honorable federal service, illegally detained and stripped of her late son's photograph by a program her own tax dollars helped fund. The council chamber was full by the time Jackson walked in, Diesel at heel, and took a seat in the front row beside Eleanor, who wore a donated coat that actually fit and sat with her spine straight in a way that made several people in that room look twice. Holloway spoke first, the way powerful men always do when they sense a room shifting under them. And he spoke with the same easy confidence that had worked on every council meeting before this one. He called the article one-sided. He called the arrest standard procedure, regrettably applied. He looked directly at Eleanor while he said the word regrettably, and something in his expression suggested he believed the word alone would be sufficient. Jackson stood when the floor opened for public comment. He didn't raise his voice. He gave his name, his rank, and 19 years of federal service in 11 words, then said exactly what he had come to say. I spent 2 decades reading people who were trying to look calm while they were lying. Mr. Holloway is good at it. He's just not as good as he thinks. He laid it out the way he'd once laid out intelligence to a room of officers who needed facts, not opinions. The financed police chief, the unrecorded sweep budget, the confiscated property that violated 3 separate sections of state law. A pattern stretching back 8 months, and at least 11 other people who'd been swept off Holloway's active corridor with no record kept of where their belongings went. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Jackson said. Detective Mara Ellison from the county sheriff's office is sitting in the back of this room. She opened a formal inquiry into the BID sweep program this morning. I'd suggest Mr. Holloway save whatever he's about to say for her. Holloway's composure didn't break all at once. It went the way ice goes on a lake that's already been cracking for weeks. A long pause, a reach for words that weren't quite there, and a sentence that started with "you don't understand the pressures of," and ended nowhere at all, because nobody in that room was interested in his pressures. Detective Ellison stood. She didn't make a scene. She simply asked Holloway, with complete professional courtesy, whether he'd prefer to continue this conversation at the council podium or at her office downtown. He chose neither, immediately, and left through the side door instead, and the room, for a long moment, simply sat in the particular silence that follows the public collapse of a man who had never once imagined it could happen to him. Diesel, the entire time, never moved from Eleanor's feet. Preston Holloway was charged 6 weeks later with theft of services, 2 counts of unlawful seizure of personal property, and 1 count of obstruction tied to the police chief's financing arrangement. He resigned from the BID before the council could vote to remove him. The county settled with 11 plaintiffs, Eleanor among them, for a sum that would never replace what had been lost, but that finally, formally, admitted it had been taken. 8 months later, on a warm May morning, Eleanor Voss sat on the porch of a small transitional apartment 2 blocks from the river, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching Diesel chase a tennis ball across the new community garden the Sentinel had helped fund in her name. She had a part-time position now, 3 days a week, helping the regional K9 program assess young dogs for temperament, the same work she'd done at Lackland, on a smaller scale, with the same patient hands. She kept a photograph of her son on the windowsill, replaced and reframed, where the morning light reached it first. Jackson came by most Sundays. Sometimes he brought Diesel. Sometimes Diesel simply walked himself there from 2 blocks away and waited on her porch until someone let him in. The nerve damage in Jackson's knee never improved. The silence in his own house never quite went away either. But somewhere between the council meeting and the Sunday visits, he had stopped waiting to feel useful and started simply being it, the way Diesel always had. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles with thunder or proof. Sometimes he sends them on a leash, walking 6 blocks ahead of the man holding it, because the dog remembers what the world forgot. Sometimes the people we step around on a cold bench are not strangers at all. They are the ones who once taught loyalty to something that couldn't speak. And loyalty, once it is taught, does not forget who gave it. The world is not saved by the loudest voice in the room. It is saved by the quiet ones who keep their promises. To a country, to a son who didn't come home, to a dog who never stopped looking for the hand that trained him. God does not always remove the cold, but sometimes He sends something warm enough to sit down beside you on the bench and refuse to leave. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no kindness, once given, is ever truly forgotten, not by a dog, and not by the God who sees what the rest of the world walks past. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen an animal recognize someone the rest of the world had stopped seeing. We'd like to hear that story too. If you believe in loyalty, in second chances, and in the quiet courage of people who refuse to keep walking, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep you watchful for the ones still waiting to be recognized.